Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering What We Do in the Shadows. Season 2, Episode 8, Collaboration. In this episode, Guillermo believes that he has left his master for somebody who really appreciates him. But as it turns out, they only appreciate him because they are just like him. What a bummer. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Max for commissioning this episode. What's up, Max, if you're out there? So, there is... this episode, veers from an amazing plot, which is Guillermo's, to the most painful plot ever, which is Nadja and Laszlo's. And when I say painful, I don't even mean the plot is bad. What I mean is, so everybody has their kind of thing that makes them really uncomfortable. And I feel like not unironically, that's the way I want to say that. A lot of our feelings of cringe tend to come from our own fears about the way we come across a lot of the time. We cringe on behalf of people who should feel shame about a thing, but they don't, And for me, one of the things I've always had the hardest time with is watching people sing. It doesn't matter, honestly, if they're good at it or not. If they're good at it, it makes it a little bit easier depending. But honestly, sometimes if they're good at it, it's almost worse. It's not about the quality of the singing. It's about the act of singing. And it's often about the atmosphere that kind of comes along with that. So this episode is that plot with Laszlo and Nadja is centered around the two of them singing. And they're singing poorly on purpose. They're doing it ridiculously over the top because that's part of the joke. But they're also putting lyrics into songs that we're familiar with. And the bit is supposed to be that Laszlo has been the first composer of these songs, and they got stolen from him and given new lyrics, and somebody else either got rich off of it or it just became a sort of nursery rhyme that everybody sang. And so when we hear his version, we're allegedly hearing the first version, the original. And the lyrics are so bad. And I know that's part of the point. But part of me also kind of feels like it's... Look, I'm just going to say it. It wasn't funny. I'm so sorry if people who are listening to this are horrified. But the jokes with the songs felt completely flat for me. It was really hard to watch. This is the first time that there is an episode that I am thinking, if I rewatch this series, I am skipping this one. And I don't know that I would, because Guillermo's plot is so fun and it really saved this episode, to be totally honest. But man, it just hit all the buttons for me of if you're going to do funny music, it has to be sharp and witty, and just having it be goofy and stupid is certainly more on brand for Laszlo. Nadja, maybe some. Nadja tricks me into thinking that she's like smarter than she actually winds up being a lot of the time. So I feel like I give her more credit than she maybe deserves. But the fact of it is that the mix together of really stupid jokes and bad music and eventually a sort of drawn out performance that they do in front of people. This did not hit at all, folks. I'm so sorry. I hate when that happens. And this is inevitable. There are going to be comedies, you know, honestly, most comedies are going to have a much poorer record than this. The fact that this show has gone as long as it has and pretty much been great every episode until now, that's astonishing. So by no means am I saying that, like, you know, this has changed my overall opinion of the show. And I also recognize that this type of humor would absolutely work on other people. So I know that it's just for me specifically something that doesn't work. But I also know that that's just my weird little like quirk and bias and insecurity to a point as well. There was a meme that was circling recently. I think it was a tweet where somebody said a haunted house, except somebody is on a mic reading poetry you wrote when you were in 9th grade. And I feel like that pretty well sums up the secondhand embarrassment that I was getting throughout. So with that said, I just wanted to start off so that you guys can understand where I'm coming from on that. And we'll talk about the scenes with them individually. And I'm going to go through some of the like lyrics that I was like, oh boy, is this really... And occasionally the joke is like what makes the joke so bad, good, bad is referenced within the scene itself. But we'll get there. So we start off with Laszlo hunting in the park. He tackles a jogger who is listening to a headset, and Laszlo is beginning to eat him and hears this music. And I feel like I thought it was coming from his, but now I'm looking and it seems almost like the music's coming from a car that's passing. And Laszlo recognizes the song and it's just like, are you kidding me? And this dude knows the year that it came out, 1982. And Laszlo is getting really mad about it. And we cut from there. We don't know what happened to the jogger. I am assuming he is dead. But we cut from there to the house where Laszlo is angrily smoking a pipe. And they are listening to the original Come On Eileen that he wrote, he says, in 1852. Oh no, Nadja says that, I think. I'm just making sure about this. Yeah, I wrote this melody in 1852. It was called Chum on Irene, an ode to the local fishmonger's Mrs. Irene, charming lady. Now, this first joke actually worked for me because it is weirdly wholesome. To be perfectly honest, like he's just like, oh yeah, you know, chum on Irene, and chum is a thing, and she was a fishmonger. Like, fine, that's fine. For He's a Jolly Good Fellow was about himself, that he is a jolly good fellow. I am a jolly good fellow. And all of this is interrupted by the arrival of this dude who used to be Nandor's familiar. And this guy, he's showing up believing that he was being tested by Nandor. He got abandoned at, like, I think he says a rest stop, and Nandor had erased his memory so that he didn't remember anything about what had happened to him or even where he came from to go back to. And this dude believes I realized it was all a test, so I'm back here to basically cash in. And he is probably in his like late 60s at this point, maybe 70s. It's hard to tell ages for me, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, this guy's name is Benji. He's delightful in an old man kind of way. Like, I really enjoy him, and felt like if I were going to hang out with an old white dude, the energy he's got is pretty I think it would be perfectly pleasant as long as he doesn't bring up any politics, which I have to imagine are terrible. I think that he and his like adoration for his grandchildren and everything seem like a very good energy to be around. But when he says Nandor is going to turn me into a vampire, and the scene ends there and we go to credits, there's a real impression almost that he knows for sure it's happening, and that Guillermo is interpreting it as this guy was invited here for the purpose of being made into a vampire, which is not actually what's going on, but it really sounds that way a little bit from the out of context, like sudden way that he announces himself. So I had a moment of just like, wait, is Nandor just doing this right in front of him? Like, what the hell? And it turns out no. And Nandor is quite put on the spot by this guy wanting him to do this immediately. And you have every reason to believe throughout the episode that Nandor has absolutely no intention of doing this at all. And then eventually he like does. And I will not lie, I was totally shook. Like, word? Oh, just big surprise. So yeah, he says he was his familiar in the 70s, but he was quite vocal about his desire to become a vampire, which was so irritating, and I couldn't take it anymore. So I hypnotized him to forget about us here, and then I left him in a rest stop in Delaware. So yeah, this dude has managed to pull together like an amazing life. His wife, present day wife, is like the person who saved him from the rest stop life, I suppose is the best way to say it. And he says she found me on drugs talking ragtime, which I don't know what that means, but I like to think that his mind was so sort of scrambled by whatever Nandor did, because as we know, Nandor isn't like aces at mesmerizing people. I like to think that he just started speaking like in a completely inappropriate like slang because his brain was just all mixed up. Help me land a job in the insurance game. And when Nandor says, how did you find your way back? He says, Paula got me to try Lumosity, keep the brain sharp, an app on the phone. And I do not know if this is like a sort of embedded, what do they call this kind of advertising? Like guerrilla marketing. But if it is, very well done, very smoothly done. I like to think it is because it's such a weird thing to do, to mention. But y'all, have you ever watched a show that does that kind of like in-script ad badly? A comedy can get away with it because they can sort of look at the camera and mug a little bit and do a tiny bit of like fourth wall breaking if they feel like it, to address that. Yeah, this is an awkward moment. We all know what's happening. We sort of have to let it go. We're moving on now. There's a few moments like that in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend where she's like talking about a car that she's driving to somebody, and then she like smiles brightly at you as you're watching, and you're like, oh, okay, cool. But the ones that I remember being so awkward were on Bones, which is a show that part of me kind of wants to go back and watch, even though it was not very good, just because it's a really fun, like, weird background show. But they would do advertisements mostly for cars, where somebody would, in the middle of a conversation, just have to, like, drop in the features of the car they were currently driving. And this, it was just so clunky and strange. And it took me a little while, because it was a fairly new thing to be doing at the time. It took me a moment to really get what was probably happening, because I was like, why is this dialogue like this all of a sudden? And the one that I remember the most was that they did advertising within the show for the movie Avatar, which is being, like, remastered and put out in 3D, I think, at the moment. And they had an episode where, like, half the plot was these two nerdy dudes who were sleeping outside a movie theater so that they could get, like, the first tickets to Avatar, which was just, they were treating it like it was the drop of the prequel trilogy of Star Wars, like the way that people were reacting when that was going to drop. And nobody was acting like that with Avatar. Like, people were interested, but it was by no means that kind of energy. So they had to kind of create this weird fandom that did not exist for the show. It was just a weird thing. Anyway, product placement, Miss T says, yes. It's like, it's product placement, but, like, with extras. Product placement is you just have a thing in the episode and people see the brand logo or whatever. When the dialogue references it, that's taking it up a notch. And then, like the Avatar one, when the plot literally seems to revolve around it, I don't even know what to call that. That's a whole other thing. So anyway, just sort of wondering if Lumosity got a deal with them or what. And he says after about a week on it, all these memories came flooding back. And of course, Nandor is just like, well, God damn it. So this is evidence for Guillermo that this dude, there was no intention from Nandor that he was going to make this guy a vampire. And we know that Guillermo has been extremely suspicious of this the entire time that we've been watching the show. Like the first 3 episodes, maybe, he was pretty confident. And then, like, right about the middle of season 1, he starts to go, oh boy, maybe this isn't what I think it is. But he won't really let himself believe it. And then as he meets other familiars, he becomes more and more certain. But I think he's just hoping, which is the way that it goes, I believe, with most people. He's just hoping that, like, other people's masters aren't as good as my master is. My master wouldn't do that. My master will keep his word unlike theirs, because he actually cares about me in a way that theirs don't, because they're kind of sad, to be honest, and their situation is just not like mine. And let's be frank, this attitude that he has been having with Nandor is not unlike the attitude people just have with relationships of any kind, whether it's like a friendship or if it's romantic. You can see the evidence of somebody treating you badly all around you, and everybody can be telling you that, and you will just still convince yourself that they just don't really get it. You know, you don't know him the way that I know him. Like, I know that he's like that around you, but when you guys aren't around, he's like really different, and he really gets me, and he's like really sweet. It's just that he's like, you know, kind of awkward around people, or he doesn't know how to, and it's like, you know, maybe, but there's a difference between awkwardness and like not being good to you. So watching like Nandor sort of get exposed, for lack of a better way of putting it, over the course of these seasons as somebody who would pull the exact shit as all the other vampires is really interesting, because like the whole question of we haven't really like, I haven't sat here and talked about this, but people who are familiars, their goal is to basically intern and then get hired, right? And the point of doing that for like a job is you're hoping that the intern is going to begin to absorb the skills necessary so that once they're hired, they already know what they're doing, and you don't need to train them, and you don't need to like wait for any learning curve to set in. They are going to be fully prepared, and they are just ready to go. And I have been sort of thinking about the phenomenon of all of these vampires not wanting to turn their familiars and wondering about it. And what I think it is that the average person who is willing to put up with the indignities of being a familiar is considered too pitiful to then be a peer, right? Like somebody like Guillermo, if he gets turned, then what? Is he going to hang around with these vampires and expect to like stay with them and be their besties after being a servant? I feel like that's what he expects to happen. But none of them would be like down for that, I don't think. And the only one I could see kind of liking that is Colin Robinson, because it would create a lot of weird strife and strangeness between them all. But in general, it just feels like the kind of person willing to put up with that has a personality that is so sort of like desperate for approval and has such a low confidence and low opinion of themselves that you would not choose to be around somebody like that for eternity, right? So if you're picking somebody who actually kind of holds themselves to a standard and believes that they're worth something, it's likely not going to really work out. Like we saw, what was his name? Topher, the guy who was a Sixth Sense kid. And like, they really liked him, but the reason that they liked him was because he was taking credit for Guillermo's work and making it seem like he was a great familiar and also super fun and chill to hang out with, when actually he didn't do anything that he was instructed to do. He just hung around while Guillermo did the work and then swooped in. So if you are alone and you're the only familiar, but you have the attitude that he had, they all seemed to like his personality. But I don't know how much they would have tolerated him as a familiar without somebody covering up what a bad job he was doing. So I'm not saying that it never works out. I am just saying that I would assume the majority of people who would be willing to do what it takes to be a familiar to begin with are going to have a personality that is not compatible with just considering themselves a peer to the vampires that already exist. They are like they're just taking on pitiful folks who are deluded into, it's almost like they're like the popular kids at school who have the hangers on, who do whatever in the hopes that eventually they themselves will be popular too. And they just aren't really smart enough to see that that's never going to happen for them. Or if they are smart enough, they just assume, at least I'm protected because I'm close enough to the popular person that I'm not going to be a target for the shit they pull the way folks who are completely apart from this will be. But I just sort of wanted to like talk about that because we have seen so many times now the various little like communities of familiars meeting each other for the first time, and the way that they sort of all seem to be fooling themselves. And this episode, we get like a pretty depressing, I'm just going to jump to that moment. So, Guillermo has this thing that he's going to go to, and it's like a mixer for all of the familiars in this area. And he goes there after like leading Benji around and finding out how essentially everything that he is living now is exactly the same as it was when Benji worked for Nandor. He is even using the same pillow as the one that Benji used to jack off on repeatedly, as he put it. Lovely. So he brings him to this mixer, and Guillermo is saying, I guess that this started off as a way for oh my God, some of these guys are super old too. This is a lot livelier than I remember. You walk in and it is so dead, you guys, but he's saying it's lively and you're just like, oh God. And people recognize Benji, actually. I guess these mixers started as a way for familiars to network and exchange work techniques, but it's mostly bitching and sad hookups. And there's a girl that like approaches Guillermo and is like, if you need a ride anywhere later, my vampire lets me drive. Like, or we can just sit and chat, or, you know, like whatever. And, she's actually really cute, and he kind of bails on her. And I was a little bit surprised because I just assume that Guillermo is going to be interested because it doesn't seem like he has anything going on in the social department. So why not? But also, I don't know anything about Guillermo's preferences. I don't even know if he's like straight, gay, bi, pan, whatever. And his complete lack of interest for me felt almost like, okay, this is part of him like growing and realizing how kind of pathetic this is. Like, I'm imagining the Guillermo of a few months ago, if he is approached by this girl, being a lot more interested. And I don't know that. I'm just sort of like feeling as if his growing distaste of the whole situation is just meant to be part of his growth, you know? So he sees this girl named Celeste, and she is over here talking about how her vampire told her that it was time. Screw it. I'm just going to do it. And is telling everybody that she has been made a vampire. And I will be perfectly honest, I completely did not buy this right from the start. The whole way she was acting and talking about it felt really phony. And I began to believe it because eventually when you go to her home and you see the way she's acting, I started to be like, all right, maybe this is legit. And she's just behaving in such a way that felt unbelievable because she is trying too hard to sort of prove something here. And it turns out that my initial instinct was correct because this bitch is no vampire. The one thing that I thought was sort of interesting about this was that evidently they can't tell, because I was sort of expecting that this is also what I told myself initially, that, oh, she's not really a vampire. She's just fucking saying this. I thought all these people who are familiars work with vampires. There has to be like a quality to people who are genuinely vampires that they can sense and tell whether or not she's telling the truth. But yeah, she fools everybody apparently. So we have him talking about her past, and Guillermo says, Celeste was a familiar that I used to help out when she had too many bodies that she couldn't get rid of. Her master was a 12-year-old girl. She's been 12 for 150 years. I'd say her job hasn't been easy. She paid her dues and she's a vampire now. I am so happy for her. And as he says that, he crushes his little styrofoam cup in his hand accidentally. And I love at one point she starts like vaping blood. It's like got a red smoke to it. It's delicious to me now that I'm a vampire, but you'd probably hate it. And that was really the line that made me go, yeah, you're not a vampire. But again, if she's waited forever to be turned, and she finally has, folks who have leveled up can sometimes just want to come and rub it in people's faces. So most of me was like, you'd have better things to do than fucking be here. But it turns out that what she wants to do is like live as if she is a vampire and sort of pretend, and tells all of the people here, all of these really sad, desperate familiars, that she is going to have a minimum, or I think a maximum of 8 months working for her before they will be turned. She wants to develop a vampire community. We'll have vampire music, vampire dance, vampire origami, vampire maths. And he asks if she's fully staffed, and she says, I don't poach, but my door is open. You just have to be free of your current master. And this is the part that I find really like fucked up about what she's doing. Because like the situation Guillermo finds himself in works out. When he realizes this shit is not for real, he's able to bounce up out of it and go back because Nandor is really missing him. But I don't know that every familiar is going to be in that situation. So some of them are going to give up their situation to join her with this equally false promise. And then when they realize that it's all bullshit, they're going to be left totally high and dry. And I just really felt like once I stopped and realized how many people it seems like had left their masters to come and work for her. I mean, there's like 15 people at minimum in the house all the time. So that's a lot of people that, I don't know, maybe they're replaceable immediately, or maybe they're not. Maybe their masters are going to be all too glad to see them come crawling back, essentially. But yeah, this is this whole moment, she is just crowded with people who want to talk to her and try and like get in her pocket. And Guillermo is backing away, trying to figure out what he is going to do. And he winds up next to the like little gathering of old men, and he listening to their conversation. And that feels like that's sort of what puts him over the edge. So this is when we cut to Nandor and Nadja composing. And I have said already, some people have joined this chat a little bit later on. I see that Asher and Tom are here. What's up, guys? I did not care for this subplot, and I found it really cringy and awkward and not funny. So I'm going to kind of just dance right on over this. But long story short, Colin Robinson shows up and convinces them to go to an open mic night, which they don't even realize what an open mic night really is. He sort of lies to them and says that it's like this exclusive thing. But in the end, they go and perform, and it's like this crowd of understandably quite perplexed and irritated people. And you guys, I can't tell you that when We Make Love, We Fly Up and Down was in my head for like 2 days, and it's not even like anything. Maybe that's part of why I hated this so much, was that it got in my head that way. I think that song is also supposed to be a spoof of a song that really exists, because most of their songs are kind of meant to be like signaling that they are the original version of a very popular song. But that one, it felt vaguely familiar, and I couldn't tell if that was just my imagination or not. But the way that Nadja sings, she simultaneously adds too much vibrato and also has a weird flatness to the way she sings. So it's like up and down. And you know what I mean? It's just like, oh my God, it's awful. It's really awful. She's very good. But anyway, Tom says, I love how easy it is to forget the familiar thing is fucked up. Sorry, the text box doesn't show when I'm typing for some reason, so my typos don't. Oh, are you on your phone? That happens on the mobile app for some reason. Sorry. Tom is saying, is this the first joke in the series that's missed for you, do you think? Yeah, I was actually, like, that's what I was saying in the beginning of the episode is that this show has had a really good record. And so there's been occasionally jokes that don't land as well, but there hasn't been a joke that's really almost the whole subplot that hasn't worked to this level. And I think it just, a lot of the jokes within the lyrics felt super cheap and like, you know, a 15-year-old boy wrote them, because they're stroke, stroke, stroke your cock, stroke it, make it cream, merrily, 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 something, something cream. I mean, is that funny? The only funny part is not just saying it's surprising because you don't expect cream to rhyme with cream. And that barely counts for me. Like, no. I am, as you guys all know, a fan of dick jokes, a fan of like insinuation and innuendo jokes. I love that shit. But I like when it is done in such a way. I don't even want to use the word subtle, because that's not even necessarily true either. It doesn't have to be subtle. It just has to not be so obvious. I think that's really what it is. It has to be like you're leaving the most clear, obvious part of the joke unsaid, because it's taken for granted that we all get what you're actually saying here. And that's also the key for me of like, there have been times where I'm co-hosting. I'll have guests. I had guests a lot for like the book club that I used to do. And I would have different co-hosts over the years for different like properties that I've covered. And there were some co-hosts, and I'm not going to name any names, that would go for the extremely low-hanging fruit joke that I had thought of 10 minutes ago, but left unsaid because it didn't need to be said, because it's so obvious. Everybody's already thinking it, and I don't even need to do that, you know? And then the co-host would drop it like it was really funny, and I would sort of be like sitting like, yeah, I mean, okay, I guess we're going to just do this extremely cheap thing. And I always felt like, why is this not hitting when it's allegedly on brand for my sense of humor? And it took me a long time to kind of understand the difference between a dick joke that is actually kind of clever. There's a sort of assumption that if a joke is immature, that it's also like stupid. And that's not necessarily true. You can be immature, but also kind of clever. Anyway, all this to say that most of the jokes going on with their songs are not clever, and they feel like a first draft, you know? And again, I think that's part of the joke. I think that's supposed to be part of the deal, is that Nandor isn't clever a lot of the time, and neither is Nadja, even though I give her more credit than she's due. But it's hard to sit through when it feels like that is the show's joke as well. It's not, the joke doesn't seem to be hitting either way, if that makes sense. So anyway, this is when we cut to Guillermo, who has joined up with this new group and this new mistress. She insists that she doesn't want to be called that, and she doesn't want to do that shit here, which was yet another moment of me kind of being like, is she for real? And I wanted so bad to believe it. I was kind of like pulling a Guillermo here, to be honest, because when you really stop and think about it, we all, on some level, have this fantasy of a person who is really above us in some way, equalizing the playing field for us all, right? Like, you look at a Jeff Bezos, and you're like, man, you could change the game. It could all be different. And you've got folks who acknowledge that the way it is fucked up and it should change. And then you've got guys who suck his dick, or you got the ones who suck Elon Musk's dick is an even better example, because he is like particularly shitty and secretly want to be the exact kind of person that Elon Musk actually is. and be able to treat other people shittily. But the dream is that somebody will manage to get into a place like Elon Musk and have come from genuinely nothing and understand what it was like and actually want to help. And her kind of allegedly creating this sort of like commune where she insists she's going to make people a vampire really soon, and she wants it to be very egalitarian and all of this. It sounds so good. And I really want to know if she were turned, if this would carry over, if she would really have this behavior, or if it's only because it's not real and she's still super connected to what it feels like to be discarded like a regular familiar. Maybe the fantasy is more alive in her because she's still experiencing that for real. A lot of folks, when they get to a certain place with money or power, lose sight of where they came from. And that's like, it's a stereotype, but it's there for a reason, because there's no real way to stay connected to your roots after a certain point when you run in the kind of circles that you would if you were a billionaire. It's not even your fault exactly if you lose touch. It's just, how can you continue to be successful in that world with the same attitude that you had in the ordinary world? It wouldn't work, which is part of why I really believe that you can't be a billionaire without being a bad person. You have to be willing to let go of morality and ethics to get there, or else you wouldn't have gotten there to begin with. But that's a whole other story. So anyway, we go to like Nandor's days with Benji and realizing how much he misses Guillermo, and he is talking about how Benji is obsessed with Jolf, is what he keeps calling golf. And I love the moment where he says he's frail and not as strong as Guillermo, and we see him trying to blow out a candle and he just straight up can't do it. Which really, that shit got to me. He can't lift his like coffin lid or anything. And he keeps saying, I'll be stronger when I'm a vampire. And Nandor keeps looking at the camera like, oh my God. But again, get rid of him by making him the thing, and then he won't bother you anymore. And it seems like Nandor does basically come to that conclusion. So we have Nandor going to visit Guillermo, who isn't really like hosting him at all. He's just casually like chilling on his giant bed in his giant bedroom. And yeah, it's a shared space. There's another bed in view with somebody else's like suitcase and whatnot in the background. But it is obvious that he is in a much, much better situation. And Nandor keeps trying to say that if you had just told me that you weren't happy in your little room, we could have changed how it was done, and I could have given you the bigger room on Staten Island. And Guillermo is like, yeah, it's just, we never really communicated about anything. Celeste will come up and just talk to me. You would never do that. And he tries to be like, yeah, I would. But Guillermo basically just gets up and is like, all right, I'm done. I'm going to go see what everybody else is doing. In this fucking loft apartment, everybody is downstairs doing interpretive dance. And there's all this like redecorating going on. I love that there's a giant sort of pixelated portrait of Celeste on one wall, or on the floor that she's like deciding what wall to put it on. All of this is going on. And luckily for Guillermo, Nandor winds up leaving before shit goes left. What happens is everybody sort of begins to corner Celeste and be like, why haven't you turned us yet? You said. And she, obviously, the way that the episode's edited kind of makes it feel like this has only been a couple days, but it feels like it's actually supposed to have been a few weeks, maybe 2 weeks. And I thought it was sort of funny because she had said a maximum of 8 months, but people are already getting restless. And it turns out that she had said a couple weeks to somebody else. So she's out here just making all kinds of promises willy-nilly. So she says, I guess we just need a change in energy. And once we get that all settled, then I will begin to change you. And she asks if anybody's down for an orgy. And one girl raises her hand, but nobody else is interested at all. Which again, honestly, guys, if you're not into orgies, I'm not saying that like all vampires have to be into orgies. That's a harmful stereotype. However, I'm just saying maybe it's not for you if you're just super like prudy, because based on the lifestyle that I have seen, that seems to be a pretty big part of it. But your decision, that's fine. So she finally is like, all right, we're just going to do it. And she's like, throws her hands up in the air. And knowing now that she isn't a vampire, I genuinely want to know what exactly it is that she was planning to do here. She starts this sort of like exercise, getting everybody to do deep breathing and let go of criticisms and get an equilibrium. And she has an iPad open as she's doing this, and all of a sudden there's a face on it, and it's the Ring camera from downstairs. And she begins to panic. Oh my God, you guys, you've got to get the fuck out of here. And she starts saying, Master, I thought you wouldn't be back for another month. And as she's saying this, she's covering her mouth so that this girl won't see her fake teeth. And she turns to Guillermo, who is like, what is going on? And she says she was never going to make me a fucking vampire. All right. I just had to know what it felt like. And you see poor Guillermo's face because, again, just within his reach, it seemed like she was about to do it. And we know, like, she couldn't. But it felt like that to him. And then she literally kicks the door down and comes stalking in with her other vampire friends who are also children. And there is a fight that starts that we don't get to see the whole thing. And Guillermo has bailed, and it's like the middle of the night, and he's just got his robe on, and he's kind of like running for his life. And then Nandor, in the form of a bat, just lands behind him. And I thought for sure Guillermo was going to kind of give the game away, but he doesn't. He's very good, finally, like really thinking things through here. And Nandor says, this is very difficult for me to say. Let me get this out. I know how happy you are with this Celeste, but I have been very unhappy since you left. I just want to know what I can do to bring you back home. And poor Guillermo has blood all over his face. And he says, I want to feel more respected and appreciated, and I want a day off. And Nandor says, what, like every year? And he says, no, Celeste would give us a day off each week. She dresses herself that day like some cave pig? Ugh. Okay, fine, once a week. And he says, I also want better snacks. And he says, what's wrong with the ice chips? I don't think that we've like seen the ice chips be treated like a snack before, but that is hilarious. Oh God. And when Guillermo says ice chips aren't a snack, he says disagree, but I'm also not much of a snacker, which I don't know why, but the I'm also not much of a snacker fucking killed me. That line added to the end of it. It was already pretty funny, but the delivery of that just felt so genuinely like, but you know, what do I know? In the moment, it was just so funny. And Guillermo asks, am I not a good familiar to you? And he says, well, you're a great familiar. So Guillermo presses him and is like, so will you make me into a vampire? Did I promise that? You did. 11 years ago. Did I really, though? I may have been talking in my sleep. And Guillermo is very, very firm and starts to be like, I can go back to Celeste. And Nandor finally says, I promise. I can't say when, but I will. Okay? And that would not have been good enough for me. Granted, none of Guillermo's situation would be good enough for me, and thus I would not be in it. But just saying, I'll do it, I'll do it, I swear. I can't say when, but I definitely will. No. I'm going to need a timetable. Even if it's years away. Fine. Let it be years away. But I want to know. I wanted a guarantee in writing. We are going to sit down and fucking hash a contract out. Like, that's it. So they agree on this. Guillermo tries to give him a hug, but it very quickly becomes clear that is not the situation. And he gives Guillermo a new pillow and says, it is for beating off purposes. Which I will be perfectly honest with you guys on this too. I actually was so relieved. That wasn't even like a big deal within the episode for me. But once he replaced the pillow, a big part of me was like, all right, he's getting the idea. Like, this means something. It's so bare minimum, but nevertheless. So Nandor says, assume the position. And he grabs Guillermo and lifts him into the air to fly home. And Guillermo drops the pillow. I was so heartbroken. And look, Guillermo, figure it out. Go get another pillow. I was very glad, at least, that it was offered. But very mad at him for dropping it. And then we hear Benji vaguely saying, like, where are we? And Nandor says, this is it. It's your home now. And we see Benji, like, get out of the car looking really confused. And Guillermo asking, are we just leaving him here? And Nandor is like, yeah, drive. So the car pulls away. And I'm like, oh, man, this is messed up. And then we see Benji screech with glee. Like, he is so fucking pumped. And he turns into a bat and flies away. What? Nandor did it? Just to get rid of him? Truly shook. Genuinely was not expecting that. I mean, what? And again, I am assuming it is just, I am so sick of you. If this will get you out of my face, then fine. But I would really expect for Nandor to eat him. And that be the way that he gets rid of him, to be frank. Maybe he made him promise to not come back again. He's like, I'll turn you, but I don't want you to just hang around. You're not doing that. Honestly, that would be a pretty good deal in general, is if you're like if you are worried about the weirdness of a former servant pretending to be your equal after you turn them, just make it so that they're not allowed to like stay in the same state as you or something. Make it so that it's mandatory that they get their own territory or move somewhere else. But yeah, so that's the end of the episode. And I was just like, honestly, kind of warmed to find out that he got turned. I really thought this guy was getting screwed again and was like, this is pretty dark, actually, for them to just be dropping him off and abandoning him again like this. And for Guillermo to be like part of it, considering that what he has just been through. And granted, Guillermo does not seem to know any of this at all. This whole charade was for his benefit. So Guillermo is still in on it despite what he's been through, which just goes to show how little he really cares about anybody but himself. Like, which we did know. He's out here hiding bodies and going out and like finding people for them to kill. That's not a good person. We've been aware of that. But this being something he was willing to participate in and just kind of be like, well, what are you going to do? I was like, man, Guillermo, after having just come back and really thinking things are going to be changing around here for you, the fact that you're willing to treat this man this way is not a great sign for your future either. And you don't really seem to see it that way. So anyway, Ms. T says, I don't know how you could make a vampire obey that sort of order. Tom says hypnosis. Are vampires immune to hypnosis? It's a good question. I assume that they are, but I will say on the subject of vampires, tomorrow night I'm going to be recording with the boys from Overdue podcast. They invite me on like once a year, and we maybe a little bit more often, but they asked me if I wanted to be there for Spooktober this year. And they had a few different, like, you know, supernatural books, and they wanted a goofy one. So they picked the first Vampire Diaries book, which I did not know was a book. I thought that it was just a straight TV show, but it turns out like almost all TV shows are based on books anymore. So whatever. And in Vampire Diaries, vampires who drink human blood, especially to the point where they kill the human, have a lot more power mentally and physically than vampires who drink animal blood. So those vampires, the bad ones, have the ability to hypnotize and fuck with the minds of other vampires if the other vampires won't kill humans or drink human blood. And I'm going to assume that the lore in this show is not that complex, but it's a good question. I'm just assuming they're immune, but we do know that there's also different levels of things. Like Laszlo's way better at mesmerizing people than Nandor is. So it's perhaps possible that some vampires are susceptible and others aren't. Maybe it's about personality. Who knows? But I think really what it comes down to, you could make a vampire obey that sort of order by having enough people behind you ready to enforce it, that they would be too afraid to break it. It's all about the threat of fear. That would always be what I would assume. Just basically, like, we will come and find you and fuck you up if you try and start some shit in our territory. Like, that's part of the deal. Especially considering, like, to bring up the lore of yet another vampire property in like the Sookie Stackhouse novels, the older you are as a vampire, the more power you have and the less you need to stay alive. So you don't need to drink blood as often, and you also don't need to sleep for as long during the day, and you can get up earlier in the evening when the sun is still kind of out, and it won't harm you if you're like way older. The newer ones have to be a lot more conservative about all that stuff. So if you were going to try and set something like that up, you could be like, yeah, we're all older vampires. We've been around literally like 1,000 years, some of us. We will completely wreck your shit if you try anything. But anyway, yeah, so that's the end of the episode. So I'm going to wrap this one up. But I'm excited that I'm getting to go into like the rest of this season as a straight shot for Spoil Me in spooky season. This show is not spooky, but it just feels right, you know? So yeah, I'm really looking forward to watching the next episode. All right, everybody, I'm going to wrap. Thank you again, Max, for commissioning this. Appreciate you a lot. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.